God, we pray now that these words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts would be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength, our rock, and our Redeemer. Amen. So, Jesus has been preparing his disciples for when he wasn't going to be with them anymore. Time is running out. What are the lessons that will be most important? How could he make these lessons stick so that the disciples would be able to continue on without him? Could these disciples, very ordinary men, even have the ability to make these changes starting from the inside out? I think as I ponder this task before Jesus, it must have kept him awake at night. Time running out, so much to say, so much to transmit, and so little time. When I meet with family members to plan a memorial service for a mother or a father, or a family member, a good friend, and I listen to the stories, I usually will ask two questions at the end of our time together. The first one is, what are the life lessons that this person wanted to impart? What are the life lessons that kind of drove them, that they wanted you to take away? And the second question is, what would they want to be remembered for? What would they want to be remembered for? And I think those are questions that in some way were on Jesus' heart as well. As parents, we usually and hopefully have a little less than 2 decades to instill in our children those life lessons we think that they're going to need to carry them through life. Jesus had 3 years. His message was to put a whole new slant on how to see God, how to see each other, and how to see the world. And in so many ways, his was a counterintuitive message. His values were not those of the prevailing culture, and 2,000 plus years later, Jesus' lessons still at best make us squirm, and at worst, we shrug our shoulders and say they simply are undoable. Love your enemy. Forgive 70 times 70. Blessed are the poor. Pray for your enemies. So far this Lent, the shift lessons that we have looked at of Jesus teaching his disciples have been the shifts in purpose, in their assumptions, in looking at their resources, in seeing what and who their relationships are, and today, a shift in the notion about what power is. Now, for the disciples, these shift lessons would need to take them on down the road, life without Jesus, and then to the spreading out of his message that would continue to influence the world right up till today. And in these 5 weeks, we've been looking at these shift lessons, and they're all in the Gospel of Mark. Mark's the earliest of the 4 Gospels, and even Mark, being the earliest, was written some 70 years after Jesus. It's the shortest of the Gospels, and Mark paints a picture of the disciples that is not very flattering. They just don't get it, and they keep not getting it. Now, I don't think it's that the disciples were particularly thick or unintelligent. I think they were regular human beings like us. But I think Jesus' message was and is really hard because the things that Jesus lifts up go against our human nature. What Jesus teaches is counterintuitive. What Jesus teaches takes focus and dedication and practice and a fair amount of being really uncomfortable. What Jesus teaches does not come easily or naturally. So in today's story, we have Jesus on the road with his disciples. Again, time is short. As they get closer to Jerusalem, Jesus knows that the time of his own death is very near. So I want you to imagine in your mind's eye Jesus and this ragtag band of disciples walking a dusty first century Middle Eastern road. And I see these 12 disciples and Jesus kind of spread out quite a ways, maybe some in twos and threes talking with each other, maybe some on their own just pondering. I sense Jesus' preoccupation with the shortening of time. He knows the end is near, and in fact, on that day, he has told these men for the second time in 2 days that he's going to die. That's heavy news. And Mark, our gospel writer, flat out says the disciples did not understand what Jesus was saying. And what's more, they were afraid to ask. But evidently, these guys were arguing amongst themselves. It must have been more than a little heated argument, because when they'd all arrived at their destination, Jesus asked them, "What were you arguing about?" And they don't answer again. But he knows that they've been arguing about who amongst them was the best, the greatest, the favorite. And since Jesus had told them for the second time that he was going to die, I'm thinking that they are thinking, okay, so which one of us is it going to be? Who amongst us does Jesus like the best? Which of us is the most competent? Which of us is the best student? Who does Jesus plan on choosing? How human is that? It gives me great comfort, actually, that the disciples are quite like I am. Edwin Friedman was a rabbi and a family systems therapist, and he wrote that at the time of, or at the death of a parent, that the conditions are right for a shift in power between the siblings. Maybe the one who has been the quiet one suddenly asserts herself, or the one who had been the natural leader in the family suddenly moves far away. But death is a time when there is a shift in the family power dynamics. These disciples are already preparing and sparring for the shift that will be happening in their family, in their power dynamic. And so the disciples and Jesus all arrive at their destination, and Jesus calls them together, and he sits down. Now, sitting down is code for a rabbi about to teach something very important. So without even saying a word, the fact that Jesus has called them together and sat down indicates that they better listen up. Now remember, they'd been arguing about which one of them is the greatest and the most suitable for taking over when Jesus is no longer with them. What Jesus says next and teaches next is startling in its simplicity. He gives a one-sentence teaching. He shows them a living symbol, and he gives them a second one-sentence teaching. Jesus says, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." It's not just moving to the back of the line, it's service. And then his symbol. He takes a little child and puts it among them, and taking it in his arm, he concludes the lesson, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." So in those few words and one storytelling gesture, Jesus has responded to the disciples arguing about power and taught them a lesson at the same time. power. It drives us, it organizes us, it divides us. It's energy, it's destruction, it's birth. It's given and it's taken, it's personality, it's hoarded and it's lost. It's political, it's spiritual, it's financial, it's social and sexual, it's cultural, it's selfish, and it's altruistic. Power is for good and it is for ill. But ultimately, we decide how to use the power that we have. And Jesus, I think, wanted his disciples to intentionally decide about power with very different ground rules than the rest of the world. He says in the midst of their squabbling over power that they must shift their perspective on power. It's not what they've ever been taught or observed, and certainly it's not what lives within them. The greatest among them is not the loudest or the most charismatic or cunning or strategic. Rather, the greatest is the one who will be attentive to others' needs and emotions and weaknesses, who will celebrate their victories and be there in the dark times. Then, in the most tender snapshot, Jesus brings into their inner circle a child and takes that child in his arms like a parent would a sick child. And in Mark, the symbol of child throughout, or the vision of child, is always sick, needs to be healed, or the demons thrown out. So Jesus takes a child and cradles him or holds him and continues his leadership lesson that this child, this nobody in that society, this small human being that had not reached its full potential or definition, this child that was considered property would be their symbol for inclusion, their symbol for hospitality. The least noticed, the one who had nothing to give. The most reliant on others was to be their stand-in for Jesus, was their stand-in for God. It does, to me, sound a little bit like the parable of the sheep and the goats. As you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. In that first century culture that was all about honor and shame, Jesus holds up the powerless and tells his disciples to honor that one. Jesus is asking his disciples, his followers, the inheritors of his movement, to reimagine what greatness and leadership and power and success look like. It's an active, compassionate service to the one who cannot reciprocate. It's proactive service that balances the dominant power dynamic. So where's our challenge in this story? How do we respond to seeing a shift of power in our world, in our community, and even in our church? Václav Havel, who was the Czech playwright and their first president, authored The Power of the Powerless. And he wrote, "The salvation of this human world lies nowhere else than in the human heart, in the human power to reflect, in the meekness and human responsibility." What does service look like in this faith community? It's not, you don't have to look very far, do you? We feed and we serve lots of people who will never come to worship, who will never be able to give any money, who will never serve on a committee. But the respect and the smiles I see on your faces as you do this, as you serve, is what it's all about. When someone is in need, you rally. Power and leadership and influence for what is right and true and just. That happens here, in a community of service and support for those who are the least, for those who are in need, and for those who are unnoticed. Those who need support in emotional and financial and in our partnering with others in our community, such as community-supported shelters, for which there will be a fundraising dinner this coming week. They are working hard to build shelter for the homeless. The children and youth from our Children's Trust, many people in this congregation are so involved with that. These children that desperately want to save and protect this fragile environment for their futures. The children and youth across the nation who are saying they don't want guns that are killing them so readily available. And even our Thursday morning breakfasts. The list of what happens here goes on and on. Ultimately, we are the band of disciples. Yes, we do jockey for position in our opinions. We worry about the budget and how best to plan for our future. And then Jesus puts a child in the middle of us, and we realize that all those unimportant things can go by the wayside, that we do have the strength for this journey precisely because of our faith and precisely because of our faith community, to figure out and support and serve and send out and receive in this crucial time of change and uncertainty. Amen.